Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I grew up in a small town called Greenford, known for its farmland and a single century-old chapel on the outskirts. The chapel was always a landmark in our community, and nobody questioned the local pastor's words, especially when that pastor was Father Jacob. He was a figure of complete authority, admired for his devotion and his seemingly endless patience. If you needed counsel or simply a place to reflect, he'd give you a warm smile and promise to guide you toward a better path. I used to believe that more than anything. Father Jacob was the reliable mentor we could count on, no matter how dire things seemed. But I was wrong. Everything began to change when reports of a mysterious sickness emerged in the nearby city. We heard about unusual fevers and disoriented people on the news, but everyone in Greenford thought it was happening somewhere else. Never here. We led quiet lives and assumed we were safe. The moment I realized we weren't was the day I visited the chapel basement and saw the truth with my own eyes. But you need to understand when things first started going wrong. A few months before life fell apart, I started noticing changes in Father Jacob's behavior. He had always been talkative, greeting everyone with a steady gaze and encouraging words. Gradually, he began missing Sunday gatherings or appearing distracted during service. I caught him in the hallway once and noticed he looked pale. He said he was just exhausted from the increased workload. Another time I saw him wandering around the older sections of the chapel, rummaging through boxes with ancient books and notes in his hands. He spent a lot of time studying. Our chapel had a hidden library in the old basement, a musty place filled with religious texts from decades, even centuries past. He would vanish into that library for hours, refusing to answer any knocks on the door. Then he started placing new locks on all the entrances downstairs, insisting he needed privacy to conduct important research. Most people accepted his excuse, but I grew uneasy because the changes in him felt too dramatic. Around the same time, rumors of a strange illness reached us. My friend, Laura Manning, worked part-time at the local post office. She said letters and packages coming in from the city had warnings about hospitals being overwhelmed. Government officials were investigating, but the official stance was that everything was under control. We believed them until calls and social media posts started popping up from people trapped in quarantine zones, begging for supplies and help. These posts vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. There was something bigger going on. My aunt tried to contact her friend who worked at a medical center in the city, but the line kept cutting off. When she finally got through, her friend's voice on the other end sounded panicked. She said the illness caused people to lose their sense of self, turning them aggressive. She specifically warned never to let someone with a fever come near us. That piece of information didn't make sense at the time. It just sounded too absurd. How could someone with a fever be a threat? We wrote it off as rumor and panic. We would soon learn that it was all too real. While the community was on edge, Father Jacob seemed to slip further into his private world. He always had some form of sermon or town hall speech ready, talking about trials and tribulations, urging everyone to stay loyal to their faith. But his tone wasn't comforting anymore. It was urgent and unnerving. People whispered that he had locked himself in the chapel basement for days at a time, with no explanation. My curiosity got the best of me. I'd known Father Jacob since I was a child, and used to treat him like an uncle. I could walk into the chapel any time without feeling like an outsider, so I decided to see for myself what was happening. Late one evening, I slipped through the chapel doors after everyone had gone home. The place felt hollow in the dim light from the overhead fixtures. I made my way to the staircase leading down to the basement. The door had a massive padlock on it, one that clearly hadn't been there before. I walked around the side, looking for any alternative entry. One of the small windows leading into the storage area was unlocked. I managed to wedge it open and slide inside. My sneakers crunched on the old stone floor as I lowered myself down. The air was stale, and a faint chemical smell drifted through the corridor. As I moved deeper into the basement, I realized the hallway lights had been replaced with dull, flickering bulbs that cast odd shadows on the walls. Down the corridor, I found a heavy door with reinforced hinges. There was a faint light seeping from underneath, paired with muffled sounds of movement. My heart was racing, but I told myself I had to know. I placed my ear to the door. For a moment, I thought I heard the low hum of an electrical device, like something whirring or pumping on the other side. Then I heard Father Jacob's voice, speaking in a hushed tone I'd never heard before. It was quick and full of excitement. He seemed to be addressing someone, but I couldn't hear any reply. I decided to take a chance and push the door open, bracing myself for whatever I might see. Inside was a makeshift lab set up around an old stone table. Books and vials covered every inch of the space. Father Jacob stood over a figure strapped to a table. The figure's skin looked greyish, and there were dark circles under each eye. The person was groaning softly, barely conscious. Father Jacob wore thick gloves and goggles, apparently drawing blood from the figure's arm. Next to him, a small device was humming, attached to tubes and a canister. I froze at the doorway, trying to process what was happening. Before I could step back, Father Jacob turned around and spotted me. For a second, his eyes went wide. He quickly pulled off the gloves and lifted a cloth to cover the figure's face on the table. "Daniel," he said, voice steady but with an edge I'd never heard before, "you shouldn't be here." He didn't try to hide the medical tools or the strange, pungent liquid swirling in a glass container next to him. He simply stared at me, his expression half challenging, half intrigued. I tried to speak but had trouble forcing words out. Eventually I said, "What's going on? Who is that?" Father Jacob pressed his lips together and walked toward me. He placed a hand on my shoulder. I thought he might scold me, but he didn't. Instead, he offered a thin smile. "You've always been curious," he said. "Maybe you can help me finish this work." I didn't say anything. My mind was focused on the figure strapped to the table. A low moan echoed through the basement. I took a shaky step forward and noticed the person's wrists were bound tightly. There was also a metallic clamp around each ankle. The skin near the restraints looked irritated. I recalled the warnings about an illness that caused people to become aggressive, and I realized I might be staring at a victim. Father Jacob caught my gaze and quietly mentioned that he was searching for a cure. He claimed he had discovered something groundbreaking, but it was still in the experimental stage. When I asked how he found an infected person in our small town, he dodged the question, telling me it had been arranged through his contacts. I didn't understand. Father Jacob had never mentioned such contacts before. He claimed he was working with professionals in the medical field, but nothing about this basement setup looked legitimate. It was more like a strange experiment in a horror film. I looked around at the shelves. Jars of odd substances lined the walls. A few were labeled with words that looked like references to viruses or bacteria. Pages from old texts were pinned to boards, next to modern medical articles printed off the internet. I was overwhelmed, but Father Jacob calmly guided me out of the room. He said I shouldn't mention a word of this to anyone for now. He needed more time. Against my better judgment, I stayed quiet. Part of me believed he was attempting to stop the disease from spreading. I had no reason to suspect that Father Jacob, of all people, was anything but well-intentioned. But as the days passed, I noticed more changes in our town and in Father Jacob himself. We started hearing about new patients in Greenford, people developing strange fevers and glassy eyes. They were unusually agitated, lashing out without warning. The local clinic reported that they had no known remedy, so they placed the sick individuals in quarantine. Laura Manning called me one afternoon, whispering that the police were involved. Several infected patients had gone missing from the clinic, vanishing without a trace. The staff had no explanation. Father Jacob continued preaching every Sunday, though his sermons became ominous. He spoke of mankind's reckoning, referencing ancient passages. He insisted that faith was our ultimate shield against any plague. People turned to him for guidance, crowding the chapel to the point it was standing room only. They believed if anyone had answers, Father Jacob did. I was there, sitting in the last pew. I saw the fervor in his expression. He seemed triumphant. After service, I confronted him about the missing patients. He brushed me off, claiming that the local authorities were handling the situation. When I pressed further, he simply said, "You have to trust that this is for the greater good," and walked away. Every alarm in my mind was ringing, but I still couldn't see the full picture. A few nights later, I decided to return to the basement. This time, I brought a small camera. Part of me felt guilty, betraying Father Jacob's trust, but I needed evidence. If something terrible was happening, I had to expose it. I climbed through the same window as before, following the corridor until I found the reinforced door. Oddly, it was unlocked now. Inside, the figure on the table was gone, but the medical equipment remained. More notes were scattered around. Some mentioned disease vectors, cell cultures, chemical compounds. One line stood out to me. Improved strain promising. Tested on new subjects. Reaction time reduced. Before I could read more, footsteps approached. I ducked behind a tall shelf as Father Jacob walked in, escorted by two men I didn't recognize. They wore plain clothes but moved with a disciplined air like trained guards. Father Jacob placed a small metal case on the table, unlatched it, and withdrew a vial containing a strange red substance. He declared that this was a refined version. He called it the catalyst. The men asked about shipments, and Father Jacob told them the next phase would be initiated soon. They left, switching the lights off behind them. I waited until I was certain they were gone. Then, with my phone's flashlight, I approached the table where the metal case was still sitting. Inside the case, more vials were arranged in foam cutouts. Each vial was labeled with a coded sequence and the phrase strain alpha. My hands were shaking. This was not a cure. This looked like a deliberate creation, something carefully engineered. I recorded a few seconds of video for proof and slipped away before anyone returned. That night, I hardly slept. My head was spinning with questions. Why was Father Jacob involved in something that looked like the direct manufacturing of a virus? Were these men in league with him, or was he working for them? The idea that the outbreak was planned, rather than accidental, made my stomach turn. Within the next week, the quarantine at the clinic failed completely. Reports came in that infected individuals attacked staff. Some staff members managed to escape, but many did not. Soon, these infected individuals were roaming the streets in a mindless state. Local police tried to respond, but they were overwhelmed by the rapid spread. In a matter of days, Greenford was in chaos. People were barricading themselves in their houses, forming small pockets of resistance to what was now openly described as an infection that stripped away humanity. I joined a group of neighbors determined to protect our block. My parents were out of town, lucky timing, though I had no way to reach them. We fortified my friend Laura's place by nailing planks over the windows and stacking furniture against the doors. We had a generator and kept watch around the clock, rotating shifts. Despite our efforts, we had little reliable information about what was happening beyond our immediate surroundings. Internet service became spotty and phone lines crackled with static before cutting out entirely. One afternoon, a battered truck pulled up. The driver, a teacher named Mr. Collier, yelled for us to load our belongings and follow him to the chapel. Father Jacob, he claimed, was offering refuge. Supposedly, the entire building was now barricaded and secure. Many of our neighbors believed this was their best shot. Some of them threw bags into the truck and took off. My small group hesitated. We knew the Father Jacob we had once trusted was possibly the cause of all this. I didn't want to imagine that the person we turned to for spiritual guidance might have unleashed an infection on us. Yet everything pointed in that direction. Laura asked if we should join the others at the chapel, at least to figure out more. I said it might be too risky. Greenford was unsafe, but I suspected the chapel held deeper horrors. The next day, we heard a broadcast over a battery-powered radio. A calm voice announced that Father Jacob's sanctuary was open to anyone seeking help. The address given was indeed the chapel. It also mentioned that the virus was under control. The broadcasting range seemed limited, but it was enough to lure in desperate survivors. That same evening, I slipped away from Laura's house to see if I could get inside the chapel without being noticed. I reached the side entrance, which led to a small courtyard. Typically it would be silent and empty, but now it was heavily guarded by armed men, dressed in plain uniforms. They had no official insignias, and they carried high-powered flashlights and firearms. I spotted the same two men who had been with Father Jacob in the basement. Crouching behind a row of shrubs, I saw people forming a line near the front entrance. They were asked to surrender any weapons before entering. In exchange, they received a warm meal and a place to rest. At least, that's what the guards were telling them. Nobody was allowed to roam freely. Everyone was ushered into the main hall, then to smaller rooms under supervision. With some effort, I circled around the building and found a hidden door that I remembered from my altar boy days. It was rarely used, leading to a corridor behind the organ pipes. This section connected to the back offices and eventually the basement. If the guards were focusing on the main areas, I had a chance to slip in from the rear. Inside, the chapel was dimly lit by rows of emergency lamps. I could hear chanting coming from the main hall. It was a strange, monotone repetition of words I couldn't quite understand. As I moved down the hallway, I passed a door leading to the rectory. Muffled voices came through the wood. Pressing my ear to the door, I heard Father Jacob speaking to a group, possibly those armed men again. He was discussing the spread of the infection. He spoke about controlling its evolution. He mentioned that the time had come to reveal the next stage. Every sentence dripped with confidence. He explained that the sanctuary was a perfect environment for further analysis. My eyes grew wide as it all sank in. He was gathering survivors under the pretense of safety, only to use them as test subjects. I left the rectory door and moved deeper into the chapel's lower levels, staying close to the shadows. Eventually, I reached the basement. Everything felt cooler down there, with old walls that retained the night's chill. Despite the dire situation, the lighting had improved. Portable lanterns lined the corridors, and the hum of machines was louder than ever. At the far end of the basement, I discovered a new barricade made of metal fencing. It blocked an entire section that used to be for storage. Beyond the fencing, I noticed an area filled with cages. My breathing grew uneven as I realized these cages were occupied by infected individuals, some wearing tattered clothes from Greenford's clinic. They paced back and forth, arms reaching out as if desperate to grab anything within range. Near the cages stood a tall man in a lab coat, examining a chart. Father Jacob approached him from the other side, asking about the viability of the current batch. The lab coat figure replied that the mutated strain was consistent, showing high transmissibility. Father Jacob smiled. "This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for," he said, his tone low but filled with pride. "Proceed with distribution as planned." When they left, I made my way around the side, looking for a vantage point. A partially open vent allowed me to peer inside the caged area. A faint stench of disinfectant mixed with something else. Bowls of water and scraps of food lay on the floor of each cage, as if these infected were treated like lab animals. I couldn't film everything with my phone because the angle was too narrow, but I snapped a few shots of the cages, the infected, and the entire setup. Every fiber of my being told me to get out. I felt sure I was standing on the edge of a greater conspiracy. Crouching near that vent, I pieced together the clues. Father Jacob had somehow obtained or engineered a viral strain. He was testing multiple versions on unwitting subjects, monitoring how quickly they changed. This infection was no mere accident. It was manufactured. For a moment, memories flashed through my mind of the times Father Jacob had been so kind, helping the homeless, comforting families, greeting children. Now I realized all that might have been a front. He must have had a reason to pick a small, unsuspecting town as a testing ground. Or perhaps he truly believed in some twisted plan, unleashing this virus to create what he considered a new age. I overheard him speak of a final demonstration. He was planning to make a broadcast, proclaiming that his chapel was the only safe zone. People from neighboring towns, even from the nearby city, would rush there, believing they were escaping the infected hordes. But in reality, they'd be stepping into Father Jacob's web. Outside, the infection was spreading uncontrollably. Streets lay empty. Stores were broken into for supplies. The local authorities had vanished, presumably overwhelmed or infected themselves. If Father Jacob continued unchallenged, more unsuspecting survivors would come straight to him, and he would have an endless supply of hosts for the virus. The entire region would be devoured. I returned to Laura's place and shared what I had seen with the group. Initially, they couldn't believe it. The idea that Father Jacob was behind the infection seemed impossible. Then I showed them the photos from my phone. Laura stared at them in dismay, while Brian Carter, another friend from high school, just kept shaking his head. We argued about what to do next. Some suggested rallying the remaining townspeople against the chapel, but we lacked the firepower to confront heavily armed guards. Others thought about fleeing, but the roads were dotted with infected. On top of that, Father Jacob seemed to have resources and reach beyond our town. We concluded that we might not escape unless we shut down his operation from the inside. We had a stroke of luck when a small band of local police officers turned up at our doorstep, led by a deputy named Alison Drake. She and her colleagues had managed to keep a police cruiser operational. They were searching for any sign of organized resistance and discovered us by chance. When we told them about Father Jacob's role, they were initially skeptical. We showed them the photos, and their skepticism vanished. Alison Drake decided to help. She had lost contact with the main station, so she guessed no reinforcements were coming. Her small team had limited ammunition, but they were determined to do something. We formulated a plan. If we could expose Father Jacob's operation to the world, maybe we could bring real government forces to intervene. But the power and internet were unreliable. We needed a stronger broadcast signal. Laura mentioned the old radio tower near the edge of town. It was outdated, but if we could power it up, we might send out a short-range broadcast that could be picked up by emergency frequencies. We'd include the photos and any evidence we had, along with a message alerting people that the chapel was not a safe place, but the source of the infection. First, we had to acquire a power generator. We learned that Father Jacob had placed generators around the chapel to keep the lights and lab equipment running. If we could sneak in and take one, we might have enough power for the radio tower. A direct assault was too dangerous, but a stealth approach could work if we timed it right. Under the cover of night, Alison Drake, Brian and I set out for the chapel. We traveled by foot, avoiding the main roads. Along the way, we encountered small groups of infected wandering aimlessly. The only way to avoid them was to stay low and move around them, keeping out of sight. If we accidentally made noise, they would turn abruptly toward us. Their eyes looked vacant, with no hint of recognition or humanity. Eventually, we reached the chapel grounds. Guard patrols were stationed at every corner, scanning the darkness with high-powered flashlights. We circled to the back, where I had found the old organ door. Luckily, it was still hidden from most vantage points. We slipped inside, finding ourselves in the same corridor as before. Everything was tense. We could hear the hum of voices and occasional footsteps overhead. Lamps provided a faint glow that cast long shadows on the walls. Our goal was the basement, where we hoped to quietly remove one of the smaller portable generators. We planned to haul it out, load it into the police cruiser, and drive to the radio tower. We reached the staircase leading down, only to discover a pair of armed guards near the door. They wore the same plain uniforms, each carrying a rifle. Alison Drake signaled for us to wait. She carefully crept closer, using the corner for cover. Brian and I hung back until she gestured that the guards were moving on a patrol route, The moment they turned the corner, we slipped through the door and descended into the basement. Downstairs, the hum of machines was louder than ever. The caged, infected individuals seemed agitated. We could hear them rattle the bars. We stayed close to the walls, moving slowly to avoid drawing their attention. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the corridor ahead brightened. Father Jacob stepped out of a side room, flanked by two of those lab coat figures. He held one of his vials, the same red substance I had seen before. He paused, as if sensing something. I felt a chill run through my limbs. We pressed ourselves against the wall behind a line of crates. Father Jacob scanned the hallway, then continued talking about an upcoming release schedule. He handed the vial to one of the lab workers, instructing him to oversee exposure protocols. My stomach sank as the conversation sank in. They were about to release the virus widely. Maybe they were planning to distribute it through the water supply, or through the air, or even by forcibly injecting new arrivals. When Father Jacob and his companions walked away, we waited until the echo of their footsteps disappeared. Then we followed the hallway until we reached a storage room filled with crates of medical supplies. In the corner, a portable generator was humming. It was about the size of a large cooler, heavy but potentially manageable between the three of us. We rushed to disconnect the generator, carefully unwinding cords and switching it off. Immediately the lights flickered, and an alarm began blaring from somewhere in the basement. The caged, infected individuals started to thrash. We realized that turning off this generator must have triggered a power failsafe. We had no choice but to lift the generator and make a run for it. Allison Drake took point, firearm ready. Brian and I hoisted the heavy machine, staggering under the weight. We stumbled into the corridor, only to meet two guards racing toward us. They demanded we drop the generator. Allison warned them to step back. A standoff ensued. One guard raised his weapon, and Allison fired first. The guard dropped. The second guard hesitated for a fraction of a second, then lunged behind a crate. Allison signaled us to move. She provided cover fire, while Brian and I struggled down the hallway. One of the bullets from the second guard's rifle grazed the wall close to my shoulder. Adrenaline pushed us forward. Somewhere above us, Father Jacob's voice came through on a loudspeaker, announcing intruders. He ordered the guards to secure all exits. We realized we were now racing against time. The route back to our entry point was blocked by three more guards rushing in with flashlights. Allison Drake fired at them, forcing them to duck for cover. She shouted for us to find another way out. Brian and I turned down a side corridor, generator rattling in our arms. We passed the rows of cages, and the infected screeched and grasped at the bars. One of the lab workers was frantically trying to lock a heavy door at the end of the corridor. We slammed into him with the generator, knocking him aside. The door led to a small storage area with a high window. With no time to think, we pried open the window and shoved the generator through. Allison caught up, returning fire as more guards closed in. Brian hauled himself up and pulled the generator outside. I climbed out next, followed by Allison. We landed in the overgrown yard behind the chapel. Flashlights swept across the grass. We ducked into the darkness, lugging the generator in a rush towards the tree line. Bullets tore through leaves above us, and we heard Father Jacob's voice on the loudspeaker, urging his men to track us down. Brian radioed for the cruiser. Moments later, headlights appeared near the orchard at the chapel's edge. Two other officers jumped out to help us heave the generator into the trunk. Allison jumped into the passenger seat, while Brian and I squeezed into the back. The cruiser roared away, lights off to avoid drawing attention. In the rearview mirror, I could see the chapel silhouetted against the moonlit sky, figures running around its perimeter. We drove straight to the old radio tower. The structure was rusted, with a small shack at the base. A few old electronics were scattered around, likely salvage from a time before Greenford had modern cell coverage. Laura and a couple of other neighbors were already there, setting up cables and clearing debris. We positioned the generator next to the radio equipment. One of the officers, a tech-savvy individual named Carly, began hooking everything up. The generator rattled and powered on. Lights in the shack flickered, and Carly's eyes lit up. This might actually work. Using a makeshift antenna array, we prepared a broadcast. Carly adjusted the frequency, hoping to reach as wide an audience as possible. We had to rely on shortwave signals, which might carry beyond Greenford if conditions were right. Alison Drake handed me the microphone. My hands trembled. I stared at the phone images, caged infected, vials of the red liquid, Father Jacob in his makeshift lab. This was our moment to warn everyone. I pressed the transmit button and spoke into the microphone. To anyone who can hear this is Daniel Reyes from Greenford. Our town is under siege by an infection. The chapel on the hill, run by Father Jacob, is not a safe place. This is a warning. Father Jacob created the virus. He's using survivors as test subjects. Please stay away and alert the authorities. I repeat, do not approach the chapel. We're including evidence on this frequency. Images of the lab, the cages, the experiments. If you receive this broadcast, send help to Greenford immediately. Carly then transmitted the photos via a data burst. We could only hope someone was listening with the right equipment. We repeated the message multiple times. Then we waited. Minutes dragged on. We occasionally picked up faint static or distant voices, but it was impossible to tell if anyone was receiving us clearly. Suddenly, we heard a new broadcast cutting through the static. It was Father Jacob's voice. He had hijacked a local emergency channel and was broadcasting a counter-message. He urged everyone to disregard any lies and to come to the chapel for protection. He even mentioned me by name, calling me a misguided individual spreading panic. His calm, measured tone contrasted starkly with the images of horror we had witnessed in his basement. It seemed like a standoff in the airwaves. We had no way of knowing which message would dominate. We decided to keep broadcasting in the hopes that some official authority would respond. Meanwhile, we prepared for the possibility of a direct confrontation. Father Jacob wouldn't just let us sabotage his plan. We had to be ready. Our worst fear came true when the sky began to lighten. We saw headlights approaching the tower access road. A truck full of armed guards sped toward us. We realized we had only a few minutes to prepare. Alison Drake and her fellow officers took defensive positions around the shack. Brian and I helped barricade the entrance. Carly kept broadcasting, urging anyone to come to our aid. The truck screeched to a halt. Armed men took cover behind the vehicle. Father Jacob himself stepped out, wearing a dark coat. He addressed us through a bullhorn, telling us to surrender the generator and come back to the chapel. He spoke as if we were children throwing a tantrum, claiming we didn't understand the importance of his work. Alison Drake answered by firing a warning shot in the air. The guards responded with a volley of bullets. We ducked behind barricades. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off the metal tower. Father Jacob retreated behind the truck, letting his men do the fighting. The standoff escalated rapidly. One of the officers managed to take out a guard, but we were outnumbered. The men advanced, pinning us down. The walls of the shack rattled under the impact of gunfire. We realized we might not last long in a direct firefight. Amid the chaos, I saw Father Jacob raise his bullhorn again. He demanded we hand over the evidence and the generator. His voice was firm, yet disturbingly calm. He insisted that he had a vision for humanity, a path for survival and evolution. In his words, the infection was a gift that would forge a new chapter. The twisted conviction in his tone was unmistakable. Alison Drake realized we might not repel this assault much longer. She ordered Carly to keep the broadcast going at all costs. If help was on the way, we needed that signal to remain active. Brian and I took the remaining firearms and ammunition, covering the other side of the shack. We exchanged gunfire with the guards. They were slowly advancing. One of Father Jacob's men lobbed something that clanked on the ground near the tower. A cloud of thick smoke rose. Under its cover, several guards rushed forward. We scrambled to reposition. Through the haze, I glimpsed a figure creeping near the shack's side entrance. Before the guard could get inside, Brian tackled him. The two wrestled on the ground, and a shot rang out. Brian managed to knock the weapon away, and I grabbed it, forcing the guard to stay down. Outside, Father Jacob barked orders. The gunfire ebbed, replaced by the low hum of a growing infected presence. We realized the noise had attracted a horde from the nearby fields. In the distance, we could see figures shuffling toward the radio tower. The guards froze, torn between dealing with us and the infected. Father Jacob looked furious, but he also seemed fascinated. He watched the approaching horde with a strange glint in his eyes. The infected reached the truck first, clawing at the metal. The guards turned to defend themselves, firing into the crowd of staggering figures. Father Jacob calmly moved away from the immediate danger. For a moment, the fight shifted as everyone realized the undead were a common threat. Alison Drake seized the opportunity. She rallied us to push forward. We fired at the infected that got too close, but they kept coming, drawn by the noise and the scent of living bodies. Father Jacob's men began to retreat, some climbing into the truck. Father Jacob stood apart from them, apparently transfixed by the horde. He raised his arms as if to greet them. The infected, however, had no allegiance. They advanced on him without pause. One lunged, forcing him to stagger backward. The final thing I saw before we retreated into the shack was Father Jacob struggling with an infected individual that sank its teeth into his shoulder. He tried to shake it off, but more reached for him. He shouted something, though it was lost in the confusion. His men sped away in the truck, leaving him behind. The last guard at his side tried to pull him free, but Father Jacob stumbled, dropping to his knees. We sealed ourselves in the shack, continuing to broadcast. The horde closed in, but they were more interested in the loud truck engine than our small building. Most followed the vehicle, drifting away from the tower in search of any new sound or motion. A few lingered, wandering aimlessly near the base of the radio tower. Over the radio, we repeated our message. We added details of the firefight, naming Father Jacob as the orchestrator who had just been overwhelmed by the very infection he unleashed. The hours passed slowly. One of the officers peeked outside and confirmed that Father Jacob was nowhere in sight, and the infected had dispersed. Whether he survived or not was anyone's guess, though the possibility of him enduring that bite seemed slim. Eventually, a crackle came over the radio. A faint voice identified itself as part of a regional rescue unit. They had received our broadcast, along with the images. They were on their way but faced numerous infected roadblocks. We gave them coordinates and braced ourselves. By nightfall, a convoy of military and medical vehicles reached the tower, clearing out the remaining infected near our location. We handed over our evidence, the phone images, the recorded experiments, and the logs. The officers provided eyewitness accounts. The rescue unit then moved toward the chapel to secure it. We heard later that they found the basement full of caged infected. The lab equipment was confiscated. Father Jacob was nowhere to be found. Some survivors from the so-called sanctuary were freed. They described horrifying experiments, forced injections, and bizarre sermons about humanity's future under the virus. In the days that followed, Greenford remained under quarantine, but with professional teams moving through the area, the infection began to slow. Laura and I helped coordinate supply drops, guiding rescue teams to pockets of survivors. Alison Drake worked directly with the military, offering her knowledge of the local terrain. Through it all, no sign of Father Jacob ever surfaced. Rumors circulated that he might have escaped and carried a new strain of the virus with him. Others claimed that the infected finished him off that day near the tower. The aftermath of Father Jacob's betrayal left scars on the entire community. Our chapel, once a symbol of hope, stood empty and condemned, windows boarded up and doors sealed by a government order. Some people believed the building should be burned to the ground, its memory erased forever. Others thought it should remain, a reminder of how darkness can hide behind a trusted face. Authorities continue to investigate how he obtained the knowledge and resources to manipulate a virus of this scale. They question whether foreign agents or covert organizations were involved, but no concrete answers have been found. In Greenford, the biggest shock was coming to terms with the fact that someone we admired could unleash such devastation. I often wonder if there were warning signs we missed. Perhaps there were times Father Jacob hinted at his grandiose vision. Looking back, I recall peculiar statements in his sermons, subtle references to a necessary cleansing. Maybe we were too naive or trusting to question them. My phone is filled with images and videos that still haunt me. When I see the basement lab in those shots, I'm reminded of the day I discovered the truth. It's also the day I realized that human beings can be worse than any monstrous legend. A creature driven by infection has lost awareness, but Father Jacob retained his awareness, harnessing a sickness to pursue a twisted goal. Greenford is slowly rebuilding, though it will never be the same. We lost friends, neighbors, and an entire way of life. The farmland is dotted with abandoned houses and barricaded streets. Some survivors decided to move away, unable to bear the constant reminder of what happened. Others stayed, determined to revive the town. I chose to remain, helping where I can. It's my home, and I refuse to let one man's dark experiment define our future. My story is a reminder. Not every offer of sanctuary is genuine, and not every revered figure deserves trust. Sometimes evil arrives wearing a familiar smile, extending a guiding hand. If this virus taught us anything, it's that vigilance and skepticism can be the difference between life and a fate worse than infection. So I urge you, whoever might be listening or reading, do not trust Father Jacob. He created the zombie infection. If he somehow survived, stay clear of him. If you encounter a supposed safe haven that seems too good to be true, remember the cages in the basement. Remember the vile experiments carried out in the name of salvation. The undead may be relentless, but a human mind bent on control can be far more terrifying. This message is all I can give you. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I'm speaking from what's left of Greenford. We won't remain silent. The world must know that this apocalypse wasn't a random tragedy. It was planned by a man we once viewed as a spiritual leader. A man who decided his vision outweighed our lives. If you receive this, stay cautious, spread the word, survive, and never forget that sometimes the most dangerous threats are those guiding you from the pulpit. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.